Hello again. This is Rob Wageter from Microsoft, and today I wanted to talk to you about Windows Server 2012 R2. Specifically, we're going to talk about how to set up a virtual machine. Some things have changed since the original Server 2008 and setting up virtual machines, so I wanted to go through a couple of those. So the first thing we're going to do is move into our Hyper-V Manager and go ahead and click New Virtual Machine. So I'm going to start with the New Virtual Machine wizard and specify a name and location. So I'm going to name it Windows 8 Enterprise, and I'm going to store it on my D drive. Now, one of the new additions in Server 2012 R2 is this concept of Generation 1 or Generation 2 virtual machines. Generation 1 virtual machines are the legacy virtual machines we're accustomed to in Hyper-V. They require an IDE drive to boot from. Now, the virtual hard drive format is identical, whether it's IDE or SCSI, but we require an IDE controller for legacy compatibility. In Generation 2 virtual machines, we can now boot right off a SCSI controller, and it also includes the new features and capabilities like Pixie boot using a standard network adapter as opposed to a legacy NIC, and some other UEFI type capabilities in our virtual environment. So we're going to go ahead and create a Generation 2 virtual machine. Now take note, once this virtual machine is created, you can't change its generation. You can take the virtual hard drive and map it to a new virtual machine, but the virtual machine configuration file itself cannot be changed from Generation 1 to Generation 2 or back. So now our startup memory. For most of the Windows client OSs, 512 meg of memory is great to go ahead and use as startup memory, and then I go ahead and enable dynamic memory here. I configure my networking. Now, if you remember when we set up Hyper-V, we created this virtual NIC called VM NIC, so I'll go ahead and connect that to my virtual machine. So here we'll go ahead and tell it to create a virtual hard disk. If I had an existing virtual hard disk that I could just connect to, I could do it here, or I could attach my virtual hard disk later if I just wanted to create this virtual machine configuration. For my installation options, I'm going to go ahead and install from a bootable ISO. And so here is the summary of what we're about to create. Go ahead and click Finish, and it'll go ahead and create this virtual machine for us now. Now, before I boot this virtual machine for the first time, I want to go into virtual machine settings and check a few things. Like memory. By default, when I enable dynamic memory, it'll give me the minimum of whatever I define my minimum as. But my maximum is pretty huge. For this client OS, I never want to give it more than 2 gig, and I know that, so I can go ahead and define that now. I can also specify this memory buffer. Now, this memory buffer is around dynamic memory, and what this says is if my virtual machine only has half a gig of memory, 512 meg, I want you to keep an extra 20% around for an emergency if you're able to. What this says is it'll keep an extra little bit of memory available to pop right into my virtual machine if my virtual machine starts asking for RAM. That way the host knows just to reserve that 20% if possible. The other thing we have here is memory weight. How important is this virtual machine's memory needs compared to the other virtual machines running on this host? If this was, say, a development environment, I could say its memory needs were less important than, say, my production VMs. Or if this was a critical VM, I could say that its memory importance was very high, and if it ever needed memory, it needed to get it first. For ours, I'll go ahead and leave this at mid-range. A few other things I want to touch on while we're here. The firmware. Keep in mind that we're using a Generation 2 virtual machine, so we can enable secure boot. This makes sure that nothing gets between our boot OS and the hypervisor. So this is how we can protect our virtual machines from being rooted. The other thing I want you to take note of as we move through here is there isn't an IDE controller anymore. IDE controllers are not supported in Generation 2 virtual machines. Everything is done via SCSI controller. My network adapter and hard drive are listed here. I also can move down here and see my hard drive and some of the advanced features available to it, like quality of service. So what I really like about R2 is it gives you the ability to define QoS for your disk I/O. And then I can even enable virtual hard disk sharing. So if you're a service provider and you want to provide a platform so that your customers could cluster virtual machines, you can actually do this with virtual hard disk sharing now, and you don't have to give them access to your shared storage anymore. My DVD drive, again, just pointing to the image. and notice my SCSI channels, right? My network adapter. We've made some additional improvements here around networking as well. Bandwidth management, so I can specify the minimum and maximum bandwidth for this virtual machine. Hardware acceleration. So use some of the hardware acceleration capabilities that are built into our NICs these days. We can offload some of this stuff right to the NIC instead of having to do it all in emulation. And we can even enable single root I/O virtualization. Again, it's hardware specific, but the great part is now we can enhance our throughput through these virtual networks. Some other advanced features, again, we can define a static MAC address like we've always been able to do. We could enable MAC spoofing as well. I love DHCP guard. So I could set up a virtual machine for somebody and enable DHCP guard, which drops DHCP messages from unauthorized virtual machines. So let's say we created a virtual machine and someone else was able to configure the OS and they wanted to make it a DHCP server. All we have to do is enable DHCP guard, and even if they have, we're going to drop those DHCP requests so that it doesn't become a rogue DHCP server in our network. Router guard, same kind of concept. If somebody wanted to create a router and intercept our traffic, we could put a stop to it right here. And then this protected network. I really like this one because this says, if my network stops working, move to another host. So now I can trap on a network failure and move to a different host. Port mirroring allows us to monitor traffic, incoming or outgoing, and copy it to another virtual machine so that we can monitor it there. And then NIC teaming. Server 2012 includes the ability to do NIC teaming native to the OS. What we've done here is said you can now team virtual adapters within a virtual machine itself. So I could create 2 or 3 or 4 virtual adapters through my virtual switch and then let the virtual OS actually team those adapters. Some of the things that we've had here from the beginning, right? Name, integration services, what integration services will be offered, a checkpoint file location. We've moved away from the name snapshot to checkpoint. So checkpoints are that same kind of concept where we'll take a picture of this virtual machine at a specific instance and save that. Smart paging file. Smart paging file is a really interesting concept when it talks about memory management and a virtual machine restart. Let's say our startup memory is larger than our minimum memory. Because there are times, let's say, we'll move back up to memory for a moment. There may be times when we start a virtual machine when startup actually consumes more resources than steady state runtime. So we can configure startup RAM at 512 meg, or we could configure it at a gig, right? And we could configure minimum RAM at less than startup RAM. What smart paging does for us is says if I'm restarting this virtual machine and as it goes to restart, there's not enough memory to meet this startup RAM requirement because maybe it's a gig and minimum RAM's 512 and all it had was 512. Smart paging will actually virtualize RAM on disk. This is the only time that we do this, is on a restart of a virtual machine, so that we give it the available memory it needs so that it can go ahead and come up because we don't have any physical RAM we can assign to it right now. So that's what smart paging does for us. Automatic start action, automatic stop action, those are basically the same that we saw in Server 2008. The last thing I want to touch on is processor. So in our processor, we have the ability to assign virtual processors to this virtual machine. This particular server gives me 8 cores, so I could assign up to 8 virtual processors to my virtual machine. I'm going to move this back down to 4. I have my compatibility option. So if I have different versioned CPUs, I can check this box and make sure I can live migrate from, say, a newer generation CPU to an older generation CPU. So in Server 2012, we also have this concept of NUMA, non-uniform memory access. As we look at these bigger servers, all of a sudden every CPU can't manage every bit of memory, and so NUMA helps the multiprocessor virtual machine scale better. So that's what it takes to create a virtual machine. So now we'll go ahead and connect to this virtual machine and then power it on. So all I wanted to touch on today was how to set up this virtual machine. And so what I'll do is walk through this setup process and come back to you when it's done just to show you this running virtual machine and to remind you that I'm installing Windows 8 Enterprise on Windows Server 2012 R2. So I need to install updated virtual machine editions into my Windows 8 Enterprise. So once I get Windows 8 installed, I'll come back to you and then I'll show you how we install those virtual machine editions. Now that we have our Windows 8 virtual machine created, we can update the synthetic drivers within the virtual machine. We just do that by saying Insert Integration Services Setup Disk, move over to Explorer, and install these integration services. So these give us the new drivers for R2 to tell Windows 8 Enterprise how to interact with the R2 hypervisor. It sees a previous version. Those were shipped with Windows 8. We'll uninstall those and then reinstall the new ones. And once the services are installed, of course, we need to reboot. And then once this virtual machine comes up, it'll be fully prepared to run on top of Windows Server 2012 R2. So that's all I wanted to cover today. Again, thank you for your time, and I hope you have a good day.